This week, we'll be talking about how language is used as a tool of discrimination, and how knowledge of linguistics can make the world a better place. The title of this week's lecture refers to social justice, which is a rather loaded and provocative term. Many people understandably have an immediately positive or negative reaction to it, often without really knowing what it means. Thus, it's important that we break it down to a core, central meaning to ground our discussion, and hopefully better understand why we even need to talk about social justice at all, especially with respect to language, and why it's such a polarizing concept. Let's begin by defining a less provocative term, a social structure. A social structure is any sort of system within a society that gives it structure, dividing up the members into different groups with different roles. These structures can be purely social constructs that arise naturally through ordinary daily human interaction, such as cultural traditions and behavioral norms. They may be objective, measurable demographic facts, such as age and income. And they may be more intentional and formalized, such as legal and educational systems. Basically, any way of grouping and sorting humans in a society is a type of social structure. These structures are not inherently negative. Society is made up of distinct individuals. We are not a homogeneous hive mind with a single collective personality, behavior, and belief system. Having structure to our society is just a natural outcome of our own human individuality. That said, social structures can have negative consequences. Despite the vast natural diversity across humans, we also exhibit in-group favoritism, a natural tendency to give preferential treatment to those who are similar to us, and consequently, a natural tendency to be biased against those who are dissimilar. We don't fully understand all of the reasons why in-group favoritism even exists, but it seems to be tied, at least in part, to increased self-esteem, maybe to an evolutionary reaction to competition for scarce resources, and possibly to neurochemicals like oxytocin. When it comes to a social structure, this means that the box we're in may turn out to be advantaged or disadvantaged, depending on how many other people are in similar boxes and how similar they view us. But in theory, this shouldn't be a problem. There isn't just one single massive social structure with everyone getting just one box forever and ever. We are all part of countless different social structures, so we end up in many different boxes throughout society. Statistically speaking, if we are randomly assigned to these boxes with equal probability for each, we would expect to find ourselves in a mixture of favorable boxes and unfavorable boxes. But on balance, everyone should come out roughly equal overall. However, reality doesn't work that way. Social structures are not completely separate from each other. They intersect. There's a lot of interdependency between social structures, and thus between the boxes we end up in. For example, income is not completely separate from education. The more money you have, the more you can invest in your education. You can hire private tutors. You can spend more time studying rather than having to go work a part-time job to pay for tuition or to supplement your family's income to survive. You can afford schools with better resources, modern lab equipment, well-stocked libraries, learning centers, highly trained faculty. You have stability and consistency in your home life. Your hydro is paid. Your internet is fast. You have ready access to high-quality food. You have better opportunities for healthcare, cultural enrichment, and so on. Of course, this is not to say that money guarantees educational success, or that being poor prevents it. But overall, money certainly helps. It gives you support and flexibility that can make your path through the educational system easier in many ways. And the interdependency between money and education goes the other direction. The better your education, the more demand there will be for your skills. If someone is looking for a doctor, are they going to prefer one who got a C average from a low-ranked school with antiquated resources and lax standards? Or will they prefer one who got an A average from a top-tier school with cutting-edge equipment and world-renowned experts on the staff? And of course, basic economics tells us that if something is in higher demand, people will be willing to pay more for it. These are natural, perhaps even unavoidable, intersections between different social structures. But there are also some more insidious intersections that arise from prejudice, ignorance, and outright hatred. One social structure that suffers from this is housing. Housing is a social structure because the neighborhoods and type of housing we live in vary across society. Some neighborhoods are safer and closer to shopping, schools, hospitals, and other resources. Some housing is physically more comfortable, leading to a higher quality of home life and better overall psychological well-being. Of course, like education, housing is intimately linked to income because better housing tends to cost more money. But it turns out that access to housing is often linked to other seemingly irrelevant social structures. For example, study after study shows that potential renters or buyers have an easier or harder time getting access to housing if they come from particular minoritized groups. In a study of online apartment ads in Toronto, Bernie Hogan and Brent Berry sent over 5,000 emails to landlords for apartment listings on Craigslist, using a mix of different names for the senders. They found that names stereotypically associated with minoritized groups, such as Imam Mubarak, Lee Chen, and Tanisha Davis, were discriminated against more often than stereotypically white names like Matthew O'Reilly and Barbara Osborne. This discrimination was often just a higher rate of being ignored, but it was also often direct, for example, by the landlord imposing more requirements on the potential renter, being less flexible on terms, or just generally signaling some type of reluctance to rent to them. This sort of discrimination shows up in many other aspects of society. Minoritized groups are discriminated against in employment, education, and even in the legal system. Simply having the wrong name or the wrong skin color can mean getting worse housing, worse jobs, worse education, and worse outcomes in the legal system. And since all of these social structures have natural connections amongst themselves, the result is that starting off in a disadvantaged box in just one social structure can have a cascade effect on your status in many other social structures. And this is where social justice comes in. Many of these social structures are unjust because you can end up being disadvantaged because of factors that are not only beyond your control, but that are utterly irrelevant. Whether your name is Tanisha Davis or Barbara Osborne, or whether your skin color is dark mocha or light beige, has absolutely nothing at all to do with whether you would be a good tenant or a hardworking, competent employee, or deserve 6 months or 1 year of jail time for petty theft. And yet, over and over again, we find that people do make precisely these judgments. It's disturbing that this happens at all, but it's downright horrific just how common it is. As I use the term here, social justice is a multifaceted approach to understanding and eradicating unjust social structures. This can happen at various levels. At the barest minimum, we can work just to try to identify when a given social structure is unjust. Sometimes it's not obvious, though if you're a member of a visible minoritized group, or if you have a stereotypically non-white name, you are probably very aware of many of these unjust social structures. But to me, beginning to see this injustice in the world is part of social justice. If you can tell when someone is unfairly discriminated against, when they do not have full access to the rights and privileges of society that other people do, then you have already engaged in social justice. At the next level, beyond just recognition of injustice, is tracing it to understand its sources. We do this by exploring the various interrelationships between unjust social structures, how being disadvantaged in one aspect of society can trigger disadvantage in another aspect. The next levels of social justice involve actual response, and there are many levels to this as well. At the most basic level, you can respond personally. When you find yourself in a position of power where you have the opportunity to give someone social access of some sort, make sure you are aware of your own biases and how they may play a role in your actions. After understanding how social injustice works, you then have the power to change your behavior in response to it. None of us can be expected to fully eliminate all of our biases. They are very deep and difficult to overcome. But if you can do anything, no matter how small, to minimize the hold they have over you, you have engaged in social justice. Beyond that, there are larger actions you can take. You can spread awareness, perhaps by teaching other people about unjust social structures, maybe in a university classroom just like this one. You could lobby politicians to enact laws to respond to social injustice. You could run for office yourself. And this is why the term social justice is so divisive. It's actually a complex set of thoughts and actions, and some people fit some aspects, and some people fit others. And some of these, such as political activism, are themselves going to be divisive simply because of their nature. But if you boil all this down to the bare minimum and look at social justice at that very first level, just understanding what the world actually looks like and why it looks the way it does, that's nothing controversial. It's just knowledge, just descriptive facts about the world. Knowing more about the world around you should not be a negative thing. So, where does language fit in? Recall our discussion of sociolinguistics from 2 weeks ago. We looked at how language varies between different social groups, which means that language itself is a social structure. This is just a natural property of how language works. It is constantly changing from one generation to the next, even within a generation, over the lifespan of individuals in the community. And changes within a particular social group tend to propagate within that social group. So any other sort of social structure is likely to end up causing a parallel distinction between language varieties. And this means we will naturally associate other social structures to language social structures. How could we not? If we notice that a lot of people from one social group have some similar patterns in their language use, then it's only logical to assume those patterns are connected to that social group. Indeed, this is part of the efficiency of human language. We communicate a huge amount of social information simply by using different varieties of a language, without having to be explicit about that social information. But a consequence of this is that if a particular social group carries prestige or stigma because of their social status, then their language usage will also carry that prestige or stigma. What's interesting about this is that there is no objective reason inherent to the structure of a language why one linguistic variety should be more valued than another. All languages and all language varieties are built from the same atomic units, and they satisfy the same requirements for being a language. They're all full-fledged communication systems, equipped with the same types of regular phonological rules and morphosyntactic structures. They can all express the same range of concepts, from mundane daily activities to complex philosophical conjectures. None of them are more sophisticated or more efficient or more suited to the human body. French is not objectively more logical than English. Québécois is not an objectively inferior form of European French. They are all equally valid. And yet, we often impose qualitative judgments on language varieties anyway. Varieties that differ from our own are often described as lazy or broken or having bad grammar. And we extend those judgments to reinforce our stereotypes about people, about human beings. Someone who speaks lazy English must be a lazy person. Not surprisingly, the people we think of as having lazy language are exactly the same people who fit into the less desirable boxes in other social structures. They have worse jobs, so they must be lazy workers. They do worse in school, so they must be lazy students. They spend more time in jail, so they must be lazy citizens. But what's the harm? These are inaccurate thoughts, but they're just thoughts, right? Unfortunately, no. As we've already seen, your name can have an impact on your access to housing, and as many other similar studies show, to a variety of other social structures. The same is true for the language you speak. If you speak a stigmatized language variety, you are less likely to be offered a prestigious job, or less likely to get into a prestigious university, or, just like with names, more likely to be discriminated against in housing. John Baugh conducted a study of this kind of linguistic profiling, in which he called up landlords in different neighborhoods in the San Francisco Bay Area to discuss apartments they had advertised for rent. Baugh used the same starting line for each call. "Hello, I'm calling about the apartment you have advertised in the paper." Because of his linguistic background, Baugh was able to fluently switch from one call to another between 3 different dialects of American English: Standardized American English, African American English, and Chicano English. Baugh found that Standardized American English was treated roughly the same in every neighborhood, getting a fairly consistent response rate of about 60 to 70%. Disturbingly, when he used either of the 2 minoritized dialects in predominantly white neighborhoods, response rates were as low as 20 to 30%. Landlords were choosing not to respond to potential renters based simply on the dialect of English they heard, which they undoubtedly connected to various social stereotypes they have about the speakers of those dialects. And it's not just housing. This effect shows up in nearly every aspect of society, because all of our social structures are linked together. Whether it's housing or employment or education or the courtroom, the language you use can open or close doors to you, regardless of your actual qualifications. And this can have long-lasting repercussions, not just for you, but for your children and your descendants for generations. For example, consider language education in school. In many communities, the local spoken language is taught as a subject in school, and everyone in the community is expected to study it. Even those who acquired it natively as children and are already fluent in the language. Or at least, they're fluent in some version of the language. Recall that everyone uses language somewhat differently. Not only are there different dialects, but even within the same dialects, we all use our own idiolect with slight variations from one to the other. So what is the relationship between these dialects and idiolects and the language being taught in schools? This is again where prestige plays a role. People with various kinds of social prestige, rich, educated, white, male, often have similar linguistic patterns because they are socialized together, and these patterns inherit their social prestige. These patterns then typically form the basis of the standardized form of the language taught in schools, precisely because those patterns are considered prestigious. Who wants an educational system that teaches students how to do anything that is stigmatized? And so everyone in these language classes in school is expected to learn the standardized, prestigious form of the language. But what happens when a student already speaks an idiolect that's very close to that? Maybe because they come from prestigious social circumstances. Well, then they have less work to put in. If they are already, say, 80% competent in the language being taught, they don't need to do very much to succeed. They come to school equipped with a natively acquired understanding of how the language functions, which turns out to be a very close match to what's being taught. But now consider a student who comes in with a stigmatized variety of the language because they grew up in less prestigious social circumstances, and they acquired the linguistic variety associated with those social circumstances. Maybe they are only 50% competent in the target language being taught. They have a lot more work to do. In this very simplistic model, if these two students both put in very minimal work, only improving their knowledge by 10 points, the privileged student would be up to 90%, while the disadvantaged student would only be at 60%. They both put in the same amount of work, but they get drastically different outcomes. And based on their academic performance, which of these students is more likely to get accepted to a good school, to get a good job? But suppose the disadvantaged student works even harder to make up that gap. Maybe they work twice as hard. This gets them to 70%, nearly as good as the privileged student was when they first entered school. But still, they're getting lower outcomes despite working twice as hard. Again, who is going to go down a more prestigious, successful path? But fine, maybe we just accept that some people are just going to have to study more than others. People who use stigmatized varieties are disadvantaged, and they just have to do more, do better, be better. The problem is, the very reason their language is stigmatized in the first place is because of their social circumstances. And those social circumstances put them at many other disadvantages. They are more likely to be poor, so they might need to hold part-time jobs to help support their family. This cuts down on the amount of free time they have to just study more. And if they're poorer, they are more likely to face food insecurity. Their family has a harder time putting frequent quality meals on the table. They are more likely to go to bed hungry. This has a negative impact on their ability to just study more, because the effectiveness of your studying decreases when you're hungry, when you're malnourished. Similarly, if they're poorer, they are more likely to have health problems. They have less access to premium health insurance and premium health care. They may live in poorer neighborhoods with greater pollution and violent crime. They are more likely to have long-term or chronic conditions that make it difficult for them to even attend school on a regular basis. And when they are sick, their parents likely cannot afford home child care, so they have to miss work, which can have devastating impacts on their already shaky finances, causing a ripple effect on all of the other problems they face. And on top of all of this, add in the psychological impact. People who are stigmatized are frequently mocked, discriminated against, and even assaulted. For many of them, this can be a daily oppressive pressure, being made fun of for their broken or lazy English, their skin color, their inability to buy expensive clothes and phones. Suicide rates tend to be much higher among racialized minorities, the poor, and other stigmatized groups. And of course, these higher suicide rates do not come out of nowhere. They stem from increased rates of hopelessness, anxiety, low self-esteem, and other mental health concerns. How can you be expected to just study more under these conditions? The end result is a depressing but unsurprising fact. Whatever social prestige or stigma you have coming into school, that is likely what you're going to come out of school with. It can certainly change in some special circumstances, but it's rare. But maybe all hope is not lost. If a disadvantaged student worked hard enough, then surely that hard work will eventually pay off, right? Well, as we've seen, this just isn't true. Students who are disadvantaged come from stigmatized social groups. which are precisely those groups who are discriminated against in housing, employment, and so on, regardless of their actual qualifications. And here's where it gets even more depressing. Consider again the privileged students. They are more likely to end up in positions of social power, such as employers and landlords. So they eventually act as gatekeepers, determining who gets which jobs, which houses, which education. When they see an application from our disadvantaged student from before, who worked really hard to go from 50% to 70%, what goes through the gatekeeper's mind? Well, as a gatekeeper, the employer most likely came from a privileged background, which means they didn't need to work very hard to achieve 90%. So when they see 70%, they don't think of the work that went into getting to that 70%, because that frame of reference is so far outside their own personal experience, it simply doesn't even occur to them as a possibility. They just see a 70% performance in what they found to be a really easy subject in school. If I could get a 90% in English without even trying, how lazy must this job applicant be to have only gotten 70%? I don't want to hire a lazy person. And so the privileged end up more likely getting the more prestigious jobs. And the disadvantaged end up more likely getting less prestigious jobs. All because the gatekeepers themselves tend to come from these privileged backgrounds and don't understand what it took for those from disadvantaged backgrounds to achieve what they managed to achieve. And then these groups have children who grow up in roughly the same kind of social circumstances their parents did. So they follow basically the same paths. The privileged stay privileged and the disadvantaged stay disadvantaged. A rare few can shift their social circumstances, but in general, it's a pretty stable system, driven by a combination of the natural consequences of human social behavior and a lack of understanding of just how different other social groups' lives can be, what challenges they really had to face, and how working hard does not necessarily lead to the same outcomes across different groups. This is the key point I hope you take away from this lecture and this course in general. Someone who has higher achievements isn't necessarily a harder worker than someone with lower achievements. Their different starting points matter. Their different circumstances matter. Their different positions in various social structures matter. And until gatekeepers really understand these differences and take them into account, the cycle cannot be broken. I hope that if you ever find yourself in a position of social power as a gatekeeper, that you'll use the knowledge you've learned in this course to help break that cycle.